Hi everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this webinar. Do let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. Welcome. So as the numbers are creeping up, I think I'll start to introduce myself. Looks like we've got, we're already dialing in from Belgium, Geneva, the US. Okay, this is great. I'm in London at the moment. Hi everyone, my name is Anjali. I am an educator at the WSET school in London. So the WSET stands for the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, and it's the world's leading provider of qualifications in wine, spirits and sake. This webinar, Why Do You Age Wine, is being recorded and is going to be available on the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. So you can watch it back again at your leisure. A little tiny bit of housekeeping. If you do have any questions, I will check the Q&A box at the end of the webinar. It should take about 20 minutes or so, 25, and then I'll come to some questions. So do write them in the Q&A box if you have any. So aging wine. I've been tasked with kind of thinking about this for the last few weeks in preparation for this webinar. And I think the first thing to kind of get out of the way, especially if you watch my orange wine webinar, is to get some myths out of the way and bust some myths before we get into the real nuts and bolts and the real question. So a few myths to kind of consider that hopefully I will bust as we go through the rest of this webinar. Firstly, that all wines are age-worthy. A really common myth, I think, that all wines that you buy are capable of aging, and by that I mean capable of improving with age. So that's myth number one. Myth number two, maybe you're a little bit skeptical of that, but maybe you think actually red wines, those are the ones that are suitable for aging. Hopefully I'll seek to bust that myth as well. And finally, that aged wines are just better or taste better than young wines. Another myth there for you, that hopefully over the rest of this webinar I'll seek to change some of your minds about these if you come in thinking any of these three things about aged wine. So as I've been thinking about this subject, I have divided up the kind of key umbrella reasons for aging wine into three, and those span really the chemical. So by that I mean what's going on kind of chemically in the bottle. That might be a reason that we want to age our wine. How is that wine changing chemically? Some other reasons as well. You might want to be aging a wine for financial reasons. You might want to be seeking to make some money out of your wine and age that wine to do so. And finally, a kind of bracket of more nebulous reasons you might want to age wine, which I've called the philosophical, but reasons that aren't necessarily connected to exactly how that wine is going to taste, or profit that you may or may not make on the wine. Something a little bit kind of broader and a little bit more, well, philosophical than that, let's say. So I'm going to dig into each of these three reasons, and then we're going to have a look at a few kind of case studies of specific wines that have been aged in different ways, and maybe a good jumping off point or a starting point if you're interested in tasting wines that have been aged. So we'll start with the chemical. So one reason for aging a wine is that the aromas in the wine are going to change over time, as is the structure of that wine. And this is an incredibly complex subject, but broadly, as another kind of jumping off point, firstly, we're going to lose some aromas over time. Those aromas particularly are going to be the fruitier aromas, the more floral aromas. Examples of this are aromas like rose and aromas like banana. These are two specific aromas that will become completely flavourless over time. So it may be then that if you are enjoying a wine that's particularly delicate, fruity or floral, it may not be a wine that is best suited to aging, as those aromas are going to be lost over time. But we'll also gain some aroma too. And this is really due to the interaction between the wine and tiny levels of oxygen that are going to get into the wine over time. And during this process, lots of different aromas develop, including aromas that we've got here on the slide. So things like caramel, walnut, lots of other kind of nutty aromas, things like almond, marzipan. So you may be gaining as well some aromas. In terms of the structure of our wine, now this is a really key aspect to why some people may want to age wine, particularly when it comes to reds. Bitter mouth-drying tannin that exists in red wine is going to become softer and smoother over time. So if you are looking to age a wine, you may want to start with a wine that's already quite high in those tannins, with the idea that by the time you come to open it in a few years' time, those tannins will be softer and smoother to taste. Whites as well will change their structure. So they might develop a kind of waxy or oily, slightly more kind of viscous texture. Finally, the idea behind aging wine, I think, can be a little bit of a myth in and of itself in terms of what you might expect to taste. Wines don't generally become more powerful over time. In fact, they become much less powerful, more delicate, and also more savoury. So that's the chemical. We have a look at the financial. So some people may seek to age their wine for financial reasons, i.e. really making a profit. So the idea here is that you're going to buy a wine with the intention of aging it in some way yourself and selling it on later for a profit. The idea behind that is that as time goes on, more and more of these bottles are going to get opened, which means the availability of them is going to decrease. They're going to become more rare in general, and that's going to cause the price to rise, at least in theory. This is definitely an area that you've got to be very careful of. A couple of reasons. Firstly, when it comes to the subject of wine, there are countless substitute examples for various wines and wine styles. So just because the particular wine that you have may no longer be available, there is very likely going to be an awful lot of other substitute wines available. So this idea is not going to work with the vast majority of wines. In order for this to be in with a chance of working, these wines need to be generally ultra premium, iconic wines of outstanding quality that are known to have a wide consensus that they age very well. But even if you do that, there's still a level of care you need to take, because over time tastes change. So the demand for that wine, maybe when you bought it was incredibly high, but as you come to then sell it in a few years' time, there may not be that demand anymore. Maybe people will have moved on. Maybe there are other styles that are more interesting to people. So it's a little bit of a tricky one, but certainly it's done, particularly with those iconic and super premium styles. And then finally, the philosophical. So I've put here wine as time travel. This is one way to kind of think about it, because I think one of the reasons why wine becomes so interesting and such a fascination to so many people is not only that it has an ability to transmit a sense of place. So when you're tasting a wine from Provence, for example, you can almost kind of taste that sunshine of being in the south of France. For example, if you're tasting a wine from Etna in Sicily, you can almost feel like you're tasting the kind of the area of the volcano or something like that. There's often this kind of connection we have between tasting wine and that sense of place being transmitted in the bottle. But not only that, when you're tasting aged wines, you are also transmitting a sense of time, especially if years have then gone on and those years are particularly important or noteworthy to you. And this is because really most wines are a vintage product. Most wines have the year stipulated on the label. And that means that the grapes used to make most wines are harvested across one growing season over 1 year. And so tasting wines that were made in these key years, either personally to you, so birth years, anniversaries, key kind of age milestones, or in history, can be very special. So the wine that I'm thinking about at the moment is wines made in 2020, a really important year for so many people because we had a pandemic. And I have a feeling that those wines are going to end up being quite collectible in years to come, that as the years go on, when we open those wines, we will kind of bring out those memories of what that was like, what our 2020 was like, what our 2020 was experienced. But that goes for all sorts of other key years, either personally or historically. And so it means that when it comes to tasting aged wine, sometimes it's not important how much money they were worth. It's not important exactly and specifically how they taste. Are you tasting that almond or that walnut? Those things are secondary to the fact that it's just an experience in and of itself to taste something, taste a wine that is transmitting you almost back in time. So these are my three kind of key umbrella reasons for why people might age a wine. But how do we do it? So there are three key ways that you might want to age a wine, or you might be able to age a wine. Firstly, quite commonly, aging our wine in an oak barrel or an oak vessel. This is going to be done at the winery before the wine is then packaged, generally in a bottle. So you might do that. We might decide to age our wine in another vessel. So here we've got some images of some amphoras, but there are other options too, cement tanks, glass demijohn vats. There are other vessels that we can use to store our wine in to allow it to mature over time before we then go to package it. But both for oak barrels and other vessels used for maturation, this is going to be done at the winery before then being packaged for the consumer to then buy. Our third way to age a wine can be done either at home yourself or at the winery. So this is aging in bottle. And as long as you've got the right conditions to do it, it's something that's definitely worth trying at home, which we'll look into those perfect conditions shortly. But the winery may also be choosing to do this well, keeping their wines back before releasing them onto the market in the bottle that they're going to be sold in. All of these things will attach an additional cost onto your wine unless you're doing it yourself. So if the winery is choosing to age the wine in oak before they release the wine, or another vessel, or age the wine in bottle before they release, that's not only going to take time, which is going to cost money, but it's also going to take up a lot of space to have all of these vats or rows of bottles being stored over time. So it means generally that when we are tasting or buying aged wines, if the winery has been responsible for that aging, we are going to be paying a premium for that. Now, this is just a start, really. This is just kind of scratching the surface on methods you might want to think about if you're aging wine. I'm going to dive in now to a few specific styles of wine that are aged in quite specific ways. And hopefully this will act as a way that you can kind of start thinking about the real complexity and diversity that's around when it comes to aging wine. I should say as well that these options can be a choice for a producer to age in oak or amphora or in bottle before release. They can choose to do that, but some producers may be legally required to do that before they release their wine, because the style that is achieved over this maturation period is going to be intrinsic to the wine itself. So some producers may be required to do these, take these steps. I'm going to start with my first case study, which is champagne. You can see this nice image here of a kind of dark champagne cellar with some wines in riddling racks, these wooden A-frames. And The rules and restrictions surrounding champagne when it comes to aging are pretty specific. So firstly, champagne must be aged in the bottle which it is later going to be sold in, which makes it quite special in and of itself. I think that the wine that you're picking up from the shelf, that bottle, all of these processes have taken place in that very bottle. A lot of champagnes are non-vintage products, and that means they come from a blend of different years. You might see the word NV written on the label. And if that's the case, by law, this wine must have gone through 15 months of aging, of which 12 must be in contact with the lees. Now, if you haven't heard of this word lees, these are dead yeast cells that we use for two purposes when we make champagne. Firstly, this yeast will give us our sparkle in our sparkling wine. They'll give us our bubbles. They will produce CO2 in the bottle. So that's one job that lees is doing for us. The second job is when that yeast dies and becomes this sediment, we're going to use that, we're going to keep our wine in contact with that yeast and allow that yeast to impart aromas and flavors. So the longer we do that, the longer we keep that wine and bottle in contact with this dead yeast, the more aromas that indicate that period of maturation are going to develop. So for non-vintage products, we've got 12 months at a minimum that the wine must be left in contact. For vintage products, so these wines will display a particular year, that's going to have need to take place for at least 3 years. And so the aromas we can expect to develop over this period of time include bread, pastry, brioche, toast, kind of biscuity aroma, and really can make up a huge part of the signature of champagnes, this crucial aging period. Now, the requirement for example, non-vintage is 12 months in contact with this dead yeast, but the reality is many producers will allow their wine to be in contact with this dead yeast for much, much longer than that. So definitely a wine to taste if you're looking to taste these bready pastry aromas derived from a prolonged period of time with this wine in contact with this dead yeast. So that's my first example of one way that a wine is going to show some evidence of time. My second is a wine called Vin Jaune, and you'll have noticed that both these wines, both Champagne, Vin Jaune, they are both white wines. So hopefully I'm busting that myth that only red wines are capable of aging. Certainly lots of champagnes are capable of it and display lots of those savoury aromas as well as these bready aromas. And Vin Jaune from the Jura in France is another good example of a wine that signature really comes with age and comes with time. So the barrels used for Vin Jaune that our wine is stored in are aged under a thin layer of yeast. Now this yeast, unlike our champagne yeast giving us that brioche bready aroma, is alive. So it will live on top of the surface of the barrel and it's called le voile. So this kind of blanket of yeast will start to live on the surface of the barrel. And these wines need to be aged for at least 6 years in these barrels. So a lot of the aromas that are going to be derived from Vin Jaune, as you can see on the slide, bread dough. So maybe unlike things like toasted bread, maybe more like if you've made sourdough starter before, if you made sourdough, that kind of doughy, fermenting kind of aroma, as well as spices like ginger. People also speak about aromas of curry leaf in these wines. So yes, they definitely become a lot more savoury. This is a very similar method of maturation to Fino sherry or Manzanilla sherry. So if you've tasted one of those, it's going to have a really similar kind of structural and aromatic profile. I wanted to pick one of these wines because, firstly, a few kind of little quirks about Vin Jaune. Firstly, a celebration takes place every year in February called the Percée de Vin Jaune, where people who live locally to the regions in the Jura that this wine is made will have a big weekend celebration where they will taste the most recent release of this Vin Jaune. And I actually went this year, and if you like lots of wine and lots of cheese, there is no better way to spend a weekend. And finally, These wines are bottled, they've got a special dispensation to be bottled in a non-typical format. So typically a wine bottle is 750 millilitres, but these wines are bottled in 62 or 620 millilitre bottles called a clavelin. And the idea behind that is that the amount of liquid that's lost through the barrel over this minimum 6 years aging period means that we lose from a 750 ml bottle, we end up actually having closer to 62 centilitres instead. So that remaining amount is lost into the air. In whiskey, this would be called an angel's share. So something quite similar happening here, which is why the wines end up getting bottled in slightly smaller formats. And it's typically not allowed when it comes to EU legislation and bottling. So it's a real special kind of work of Van Joan. You can see the images of the bottles on the slide here. Another case study, this is an entirely different way of aging once again, Grand Cru Classé Bordeaux. So potentially, I think you could argue this is the age-worthy wine in some ways. And the methods behind aging it are pretty different to the other styles we're going to look at, because a lot of the onus of aging falls on the consumer. So these wines are often sold via a system called en primeur, which means that the wine is sold about a year or a year and a half before it's even bottled. So at this point, it is particularly young. This was in order to help cash flow in the region after World War II. These wines have a long history of having a very common consensus that they need to be aged a long time before being opened. And so that costing increasing amounts for wineries meant wineries made the decision to sell the wine before it was even bottled and allow a little bit of cash flow to be added in to their operation before, rather than having to wait a prolonged period of time when it was kind of ready to release. So what this means is that once the wine is purchased, it needs to be aged by the consumer, often in a kind of secure storage unit at the correct conditions for aging wine. We'll look at that in the next couple of slides. And the idea then is that the onus is on you to age the wine for a prolonged period of time before you then go to open it, at least a decade for lots of these wines. And that's because the Grand Cru Classé wines of Bordeaux have a very high level of tannin and a high level of acidity. And both of these things are going to allow the wine to soften, but still maintain its structure and be preserved over time. Aromas are going to develop in these bottles as well. Here I've got leather, prune, earth, certainly kind of tobacco-y quality as well. So these wines definitely will become more savoury, more delicate, and those tannins are going to soften out as well. My final case study for a key wine where age is important to its style is Cantero Madeira. So Cantero refers to the method in which these wines are matured and is generally considered a particularly high quality way to mature our wines, our Madeira wines. These wines are aged in oak barrels in a warm environment with a small headspace of air as well. And all of this is to mimic the environment that these barrels may have traveled in over ship to get to their destination market. And so we kind of mimic that today. We need a warm environment, and that warm environment will allow aromas to be concentrated and the level of alcohol to rise in the barrel. This is as water starts leaving that barrel. So everything will become more and more concentrated. And in Madeira, if you're a producer, you are really incentivized to keep your wine aging for a prolonged period of time. You can see in this image a seal on a barrel by the IVBAM, who are the Madeira kind of body, and you are incentivized to age your wine. So every 5 years, if you can keep your wine aging for 5 years, you will be paid a subsidy. And The aromas that are going to develop in your Madeira include apricot, raisin, kind of chocolatey, smoky quality as well. So really, really worth trying if you want to taste some of those aromas derived from age. Now, if any of this has got you kind of thinking, I want to have a go at aging some wine myself, and if I can, leaving it and kind of forgetting about it and opening it back up and seeing what that wine is like, see how that wine has maybe developed, then I think it's a really wonderful thing to be able to do. You do need some quite specific conditions and potentially some quite specific styles of wine. We've touched on a few of these already, but a few tips for aging wine yourself. So firstly, the conditions that you're keeping your wine in. You want to make sure that this wine is at a cool and constant temperature. So no big swings season to season. One thing I really notice is that lots of people, and I totally understand why, but store their wines in their kitchen. And I've even seen sort of wine racks inbuilt next to ovens. And those ovens, when they're opening and closing and all that hot air, it will really cause the wines in there to massively fluctuate. So as far as you can avoid that, the better. A cool, constant temperature, away from bright light as well, and away from any kind of real movement and vibration. So kept almost the conditions you want to be sleeping in, as the wine is sort of also sleeping as well. So a nice cool constant temperature, nice and dark, away from vibrations. And really, if you imagine in your mind a wine cellar, this is pretty much what it looks like. It's kind of dark, can be a bit damp as well. Sufficient levels of humidity can also be quite useful if you're seeking to age your wine for a prolonged period of time. So those are the conditions. Some styles to kind of consider. Now, I think when it comes to aging, over the course of researching this webinar, I've really come to the conclusion that the aromas that develop when you age your wine, it's so subjective as to whether or not you will prefer or enjoy that wine better. So to strip it all back, in order for a style of wine to really be age worthy, it needs to have a lot of flavor intensity to begin with. And that's because we will or may lose some over time. And what can also really help is preservative qualities in the wine. So that's generally a high level of acidity, a high level of tannin, or a high level of sugar, maybe even 2 of the 3, maybe even 3 of the 3, if we're thinking about something like port. And those will allow your wine to, the wine that will then have a greater consensus that it's more suitable for aging. But personal preference is key here. If you like wines that taste really bold and fruity, potentially aging it for a prolonged period of time isn't going to be the thing for you. Whereas if you like your wines maybe a bit more savory, a bit more delicate, then definitely give it a go. Another recommendation is potentially to buy a few of the same wine and taste it maybe once a year or longer than that, particularly if it's quite special wine to you. You can kind of track how it's developing over time. And I think that can be a really fascinating thing. So a few tips to get you started on your aging wine journey, and a few styles of wine maybe to seek out and try to see whether or not you do like the styles that can be created by aging wine. That really leaves me to just say thank you so much for joining. And if there are any questions, I can see there might be a couple. Okay, yes, 2 brilliant questions. So firstly, does vintage matter when aging wine? This can have a real important effect on the aging potential of your wine, at least in some regions. So Bordeaux is probably the most famous region for vintage being a real part of the conversation when it comes to aging wine. And that's partly because the conditions over a growing season in Bordeaux are really, really changeable. And so 1 year, if you've got a really beautiful year, those grapes are very, very happy. You may end up making a really age-worthy style. And 1 year, if the weather conditions are pretty rubbish, rainy, or your yield is much lower, maybe those aren't quite the right conditions. So it's the regions that generally have very changeable and unpredictable weather year to year that is likely going to be a factor in how age-worthy that is. It's so easy to find vintage guides online as well. Sometimes I'll do that. I'm not very good at committing those particular years to memory. So sometimes it can be just handy if you're thinking about buying a wine that's got some age on it, you're not sure whether or not you want to proceed with the purchase. It's worth just bringing up a quick vintage guide just to check how suitable for aging the wine might be. I've got a question about investing wine. How can you be sure that the wine was aged properly or kept in the right condition? Another really good point, that actually it's very hard to find that out. So there are various certifications the wine can have gone through, but it's never going to be a real guarantee. In some cases it may be, depending on who's been storing it, but another facet of the risk of buying wine with the intention of making a profit, or buying wine from an investor. Do we need enough alcohol for aging? That can be important, but what's more important is that acidity, that tannin and that sugar. Those are the more key preservative qualities. If a wine just has high levels of alcohol, it's not necessarily going to make it generally suitable for aging. So something to be aware of. I think that's all our questions. So I think a feedback box has popped up. So if you don't mind filling that out, that would be fantastic. This webinar is going to be available on the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. So you can check back and watch it in a day or two if there's anything you want to rewatch. I'll just leave you to get on with the rest of your day, maybe try some aged wines. Thank you very much.